Okay, my name's Paul Mason. I work for Newsnight and I'm chairing this. I'll just introduce the panel. We've got Paul Lashmar, an investigative journalist, currently undertaking research on the way the media has covered the credit crunch, in particular the run-up to it. Gillian Tett is the assistant editor of the Financial Times. It's all on a sheet, hopefully, but this is for the people who are watching on the internet, of whom there are a lot in my experience of these events. So welcome to them too. Michael Blastland, freelance writer and broadcaster, co-author of The Numbers Game, Common Sense Guide to Understanding Numbers in the News, something we all could do with a good read of. And then Anne Pettifor, who is the author of The Coming First World Debt Crisis, 2006. If only that had been a bestseller, we might not be here. Okay, the format is I'm going to ask a question, and we'll take let each of the speakers give it 5 minutes, and then we'll go into more of a Q&A up here. Then towards the end, we'll move over to you and your questions. I forgot to say thanks to the Frontline Club for organising this. I find these sessions, all of them that are organised, very valuable. But I hope you find this, because I haven't seen a public session like this yet in the crisis. So without further ado, what we're going to talk about is, what did the media get wrong in this crisis, in the run-up to it? Could it have done better? Is it institutional? Is it stupid journalists? I've got my own story to tell about that, which I will throw in at some point. And I think we all have to sort of lay on the line what it was that we did wrong. I will be doing that. And I invite anybody else who wants to participate in that kind of sort of quasi-Stalinist confession session to have a go. But first we'll start by asking the panellists, what fundamentally do you think the media got wrong in the run-up to the 2007-2008 credit crunch?
Right. This all started with me when I was having a conversation with Gavin McFadden over here from the Centre for Investigative Journalism, and I was pondering with him that this is in the spring, that the credit crunch, I personally had no idea it was about to hit us, and I was really rather astonished. And the context of this was very much that I do some financial reporting, but I've been very involved with the reporting of the Iraq War. And I was very conscious that during that, in the aftermath of that we had, there had been extensive media navel-gazing about where we'd gone wrong with Iraq. But nobody seemed to be asking any questions about the credit crunch. So I started to look back very quickly to see whether, how good the reporting had been. And if I just set up a couple of criteria here, which might help, is that for me, the sort of, like the D-Day, day zero is the 9th of August 2007, because that's when, as Adam Applegarth, the not particularly lamented former chief executive of Northern Rock, described it as the day that the world changed. And he's very right in that much, about the only thing he was right about. And what I started to do really was to look what had happened before. And when I started to talk to journalists who'd been involved, I very much got the impression that the first serious warning signs had come with the writing down of debt by HSBC in January, February of 2007. So in a sense, there are sort of two elements to my time frame. It's what the media reported before 2007, and then the run-up to day zero. And when I started looking through, I could find, and this is not, this is a work in progress, so if someone tonight can pass me a cut-in showing that some journalists predicted this and said this is the problem, this is what's going to happen, I'd be very grateful. But I can find no piece of journalism that really correctly framed makes a case for what then occurs. And I find that quite worrying that no journalist did that, if that is the case. And I'm ploughing through lots of cuttings, and I'm trying to understand the context in which that falls. And the two main determinants for me, because it's in a broad context, you've got oil prices, you've got a housing boom, you've got all of that. But it seems to me the core areas are the subprime, the actual subprime market in America, which we now know was basically a massive fraudulent enterprise, yet nobody noticed. And secondly, the securitization of that debt which went into the markets. And according to Sealand, for instance, which is a big research institute, that there was something like, between 2001 and 2005, $2 trillion worth of CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, derivatives, had gone into the system, and no one knew where it was. And to me, these were really quite significant issues that needed, journalists should have been looking at and been aware of, I thought. If not, why not? So really, I have got sort of two propositions. Either journalists weren't doing their job, or, and you know, this is open to discussion, or secondly, that journalists, or that basically journalists can no longer penetrate the opaque nature of international finance, in which case, if we want transparency, we've got to look for new policy solutions. So those are the sort of two propositions I'm playing around with at the moment and trying to do some research into. So I think that would be my opening gambit, if you like.
Gillian, tell us,
well,
you've been writing about it for a long time, tell us what happened on the FT.
Well, Paul has set the stage beautifully for what I'm going to do, which is he set the macro level. I'm going to talk about the micro level, and at the risk of sounding deeply egocentric, tell the story of how it looked from my perspective. I was sitting on the Lex column of the FT back in 2004, which is a comment section on the back page of the FT. And I was charged with trying to draw up a list of priorities for Lex, because I was acting editor of Lex at the time. And so I started off writing my list by drawing up a list of the companies we ought to cover. And then suddenly I thought, you know what, we really ought to go back to basics and work out what on earth is Lex for. And I'm trained as an anthropologist. Before I became a journalist, I did a PhD in social anthropology, which is a very weird background for someone working in finance. And I've done field work on a couple of occasions, both times in the Himalayas. And so I sat down as if I was an anthropologist in an unfamiliar village and said, OK, let's try and draw a sketch map of the city and work out how all the bits fit together. And when I looked at that map, I realised something quite extraordinary, which was that we on Lex were covering just one tiny little corner of that city. And not just we on Lex, but in fact the financial media in general were ignoring the bulk of the activity that was driving the city revenues. So I became very exercised by that. And I wrote a series of memos internally, which came to be dubbed by my thoroughly irritated colleagues the iceberg memos. Because what I was trying to explain was basically the financial activity in the city looked like an iceberg. You had the tip, which was poking above the water, which was equity markets and M&A, and foreign exchange to a certain degree. And you had this vast swathe beneath the waves, which was debt, derivatives, credit. And most people were covering the bit above the water. That was commoditized, to use a jargon. And that was where all the glory lay, because people in newspapers, jobs like economics editor, banking editor, M&A correspondent, those were the glory jobs. And the rest of the stuff beneath the water was basically only being covered by the trade press. The FT was doing it a bit, but not as much as it should have been. So I jumped around, and finally, I think partly to shut me up, they said, OK, you move across, go and run the capital markets team, which at that time looked a bit like going to Siberia within the FT, because the capital markets team, if you drew up, if you did a social analysis of newspapers or the FT, the Lex column is obviously one of the glory spots, and it's very much closely tied to our brand. The capital markets team was on page 423, most of its work. We were very under-resourced, and we sort of sat in a cupboard, basically, right round the back. We're about as far from the kind of central newsroom as you could get. And people never came to us. It was always a question of us going to them. And people thought I was mad. In fact, I was pregnant at the time, so I think quite a lot of people thought, oh, well, she's off on, mummy trap kind of stuff. And I admit, one of the reasons I took the risk was because I thought, well, at least I'll have a quieter life for a bit. Ha ha. But I sort of started covering it, and we kind of got religion. And we became convinced that what was happening in this world was incredibly important, both in commercial terms, in the sense that it was kind of good for the FT to plug this gap because no one else was, but also because there was a very important story going on. But it was terrifically hard to cover for at least 3 reasons. Firstly, it was flipping complicated. I have a PhD in social anthropology, not advanced maths, and so I struggled, frankly, to get my head around half these concepts. Secondly, there wasn't much data, hard to get hold of. You know, I spent a huge amount of time trying to do really basic stuff, like work out how big the market was I was supposed to be covering. And it was very, very difficult. It was very tough to tell the story within the accepted parameters of what being a journalist is, because equity markets M&A have clear-cut faces and events. They have names. You can go and film them if you're poor, you know. The credit markets, I mean, how the hell do you get people excited about a story about 11 CLOs that have been issued? You don't know how big they are, you don't know who's bought them, and by the way, no one knows what a CLO is. And last but not least, of course, there was this terrifically powerful city PR machine, who their first reaction on discovering that we were on a mission to try and make CDOs sexy were thrilled, because they thought, whoopee, here we have some people coming in to explain just how clever we are and to highlight our clever technologies. And then when we began to get quite critical and say, you know what, guys, this looks like there is a serious accident waiting to happen, we then had tremendous pressure. And frankly, it was often very hard to fight back. I mean, there are columns I wrote back then, which I'm proud of, because I did try to point out the dangers. There was one particular column that, to be honest, I actually pulled at the last minute because I lost confidence, because I couldn't prove what I was trying to say, faced with a wall of overconfident bankers. Lastly and briefly, Paul mentioned that we should look at what happened pre-January 2007 and post it. And I just have two things to say. Firstly, around January 2007, one of the interesting phenomena that developed was that I started to get a huge number of emails from people in the city. Because by then people had noticed after 2 years that there weren't a lot of other mainstream media outlets covering this stuff. And so they rather latched on the team. And I got a lot of anonymous email from people in the city. It almost became like a psychiatrist's couch, my inbox, saying, you know what, I'm getting quite concerned, and people would feed me information. I spent a lot of time working out to what degree I could or should not report these anonymous things, because of course that flies in the face of journalistic conventions. Meanwhile, I had a lot of on-the-record comments from cross-bankers saying, why are you being so alarmist? It's a tough call to make. But the last point I'd make is I look back to that whole period now, and there are two conclusions I'd draw. One is we need to recognise that what's made this crisis so pernicious is not simply the fact that we've had tangible economic losses, and not simply the fact that we've had all these products slicing and dicing these tangible economic losses into a candy floss of leverage, of debt, which is now unravelling with very tangible, painful economic consequences. What we're also dealing with is a fundamental psychological shock. And in a sense, the sheer shock that's been experienced by people starting back on August the 9th last year, at least in Europe, in discovering that this entire revolution in finance had happened they didn't know about, and created such dangerous implications, that psychological shock is really what has made this crisis so pernicious. People have lost faith in finance. They've gone from black to white overnight, and that's one of the things that's really hurt. But secondly, when I look back at the period, something hits me between the eyes is something I learned as an anthropologist all those years ago, which is that is not, if you want to understand how society works, it's not so important to just look at the social noise. You need to look at the social silence too. Whether you're working in a Tajik village in the Himalayas or in the city of London, you don't just need to look at what people say, but what they don't say. And I would argue that over the last decade, the noise has been around things like M&A, or the glory stuff bankers wanted to talk about. The silence has been about that boring, weird, wacky bunch of acronyms, the alphabet soup, which it was so hard to illustrate. And precisely because there was no attention to the social noise, without their oversight, bankers went to excess. We need to recognise that precisely because journalists weren't writing about it, there wasn't the pressure on regulators to investigate, there wasn't the pressure on politicians to ask questions. We, as an industry, need to acknowledge that among the list of institutions that have failed and actually contributed to this crisis are not just the bankers, credit rating agencies and regulators, but the media too. And if we don't acknowledge that, then frankly it greatly undermines our ability to point fingers at the others. So I simply end by saying it's been a very salutary story in what happens if you don't look at the social silences, and we really ought to go forward and ask just how many other social silences there are that we're also ignoring.
Thank you, Gillian.
Sorry for so long.
Michael, what do you think?
I almost start from the psychology. What did we get wrong? I think we got wrong. Sorry, you struggling to hear me. What we got wrong, I think, is what we got wrong. What we get wrong every time, and it's the kind of thing that we've been warned about by John Stuart Mill. It's that recent problem. Alfred Marshall, Charles Kindleberger, Charles Murray in the 18th century. It's a recurrent, excessive, speculative excess. And these things happen, I think, again, I'd agree with Gillian, for powerful cultural reasons, not just because there are hard numbers somewhere at the bottom. And these powerful cultural reasons are to do with the shared momentum that you get in any group. Momentum is a great enemy of objectivity, whether amongst journalists, city financiers, regulators. The belief that what's gone before will continue, the belief that the past does predict the future, whatever sort of warnings they attach to the messages about investments. And I think you can see that quite powerfully, both in the way that the stories were reported and in the concentration and in the decision about what kind of story was important to tell. The fact that you could get this psychological preoccupation, I think, with a part of the market which was not the most significant part of the market. Now, why do people do this? Because important people tell you that that's what you should be doing. Why do important people say it? Because the other important people seem to believe it. And you get this bizarre cultural momentum, both amongst the city institutions, amongst the individuals, and critically, I think, amongst the media. So there are very simple questions you can ask, and Gillian was one of the very first to ask them about what's going on in the city. Which is the biggest part of the city activity? And it wasn't asked. Instead, the fascination with what was, as Gillian puts it, the glory part of the story prevailed. Now, I'm not in the happy position of having reported on either the way up or particularly the way down. I'm not a business reporter, I'm not an economist, I'm another humanities graduate. But I have been intrigued on the way down, because I think we're doing the same thing again. I think there's a clear sense that there is a story well rooted in tangibles, which means that people have stopped buying cars to an extraordinary degree this month. They've, cut the number of cars they buy by 23%, and if we can trace this back, we will find some mathematical reason why it's 23%. We won't. The reason people have stopped is because discretionary spending has stopped. And the key word there is discretionary spending, because it's a psychological response, as much as a real response to the problems in the banking and the finance sector, which I think are severe. Now, I'm sometimes caricatured as an optimist. I'm not an optimist. I think things could be very bad indeed, but I don't think they need to have been so. I think the banking sector, just about, though some pain was bound to seep out, could have been contained. Not absolutely, of course, but to a greater extent than we've managed. And what meant that the thing did seep out? Well, I think the stories that we've been telling partly on the way down. And I look back at the data, for example, and I compare that data to some of the stories that we've told. For example, in December this year, in January, 1 month's results for Marks and Spencer's were described as evidence of a high street slump. That word, slump, by the BBC, my former employers. I love them. The Office for National Statistics is reporting up until last month that the underlying trend in retail sales has been up throughout this year. Now, I think it's probably taking a dive in the current month, and there have been some indications that it's been getting a lot weaker. Certainly the rate of increase has tailed off, but slump? There is no evidence, has been throughout this year, any evidence of a slump in the data. I think it's coming, but I don't think it was there when a lot of the panic and a lot of the fear was beginning to excite us all and encourage us to look for confirmation of the story which we now began to think was taking hold. This cultural momentum, this thing which is the enemy of objectivity, I think. I'll give you another example. Employment. Employment in the spring of this year, the employment rate was the highest it's been in this country since Harold Wilson was Prime Minister. Now it's going in the wrong direction, fast. But what have we been saying about employment all this year? I think we've been speculating largely, speculating that the thing was going to go south rapidly. Now that speculation has turned out to be right, but is it right partly because of the depth of the speculation and the way that these things can become self-fulfilling? I'll give you one other example. The production index, the manufacturing index, in the middle of this year took a slight turn, 0.2%. One of the things I show people is I show people the end of that graph, the 0.2% fall, and it was the biggest fall, I beg your pardon, 0.5% on the production index, 0.2 on manufacturing. It was the biggest fall for a year. And you can see that a year ago, that's about what... Zoom out of that thing, and you see that this is one of the most erratic indices you can imagine. The thing is up and down like a yo-yo. And yet, that concentration on that last section, now what does that concentration imply? It can only be important, a movement of that size, if you believe it's a turning point. Because you're speculating on its future course. You're saying this is significant because we know where it's going. Did we know where it was going? I'm not sure I did. I'm not sure in the spring this year that I knew the real economy was going to take the sort of hit that it's now apparently beginning to take. So what we're seeing in each case is journalists taking small pieces of data, the small tip of the iceberg on the way up, the things that they believe are confirmation of whatever psychological state they happen to be in, and amplifying them dramatically. I don't believe that this 23% cut in car sales that we've just had is... are all those non-buyers suddenly had their credit crunched? I don't believe it. I think they're frightened. There was the New York Times the web version has a quote of the day. About a month ago, it had a quote from Claudia Prindiville. Hello, Claudia, if you're watching. And she said, all this stuff that's going on, it's getting into my head. I'm okay. I'm still buying for the kids, but I'm not buying for me. The talk is getting into my head. Talk, I think, is vastly underrated. Please don't believe that I'm saying that this is entirely a matter of sentiment. I don't think that. I think there are very real and very fundamental reasons why things went wrong. But I think there's a powerful process of amplification that goes on in the media. Amplification of selective signals. And it's happening again. It's happening on the way down. And it's going to cause us to suffer more pain, I think, than we need to. An interesting, sorry, one final illustration of this. The 1.5% cut in interest rates today. Which way was that going to take the market? Ex ante, you could have said it'll send the market up. That's a value, here's reassurance, sudden increase in liquidity, a lot of reason to be optimistic about the possibility of the banks recouping some of their losses and all the rest of it. A lot of reason to be optimistic about people's ability to suddenly go out and spend again because they know their debts are probably going to be less expensive to sustain. It went the other direction. Is that foreseeable? This is a partial defence in a way of the media, because I think we all think it's foreseeable with hindsight that the markets actually went south in reaction to that 1.5-point cut, because the psychological belief was that this indicated that things were really, really bad.
Doesn't do. It does.
Now, I didn't know how that reaction was going to play out. I don't think the bank knew. The bank wanted to do something dramatic, but I think their guess would have, they hoped probably, that it was going to go in the other direction. Did they have any fundamental mathematical reasons for being able to make that calculation? They did not. They guessed about market psychology. And the lesson about booms, busts, speculative manias down the ages is that that's what we do. We second guess other people's expectations.
Thank you. Okay. Anne, I should have pointed out the first time, well, not the first time, but before you started writing about First World Debt, you were writing and acting, you were an activist and an opinion former in the Jubilee, I think it was the Jubilee 2000 and the whole run up to the Glen Eagles. And I wonder if, in addition to all the other things you're going to tell us, you could enlighten me on what it was that switched your focus from developing world debt to this.
Yeah, right. Sure. I want to first of all say that, I don't believe it was cultural or psychological. I don't think that at all. I think it's ideological. And I think we need to address that. And I think what Gillian says is absolutely right, that the media had been captured by what I regard to be the sort of ideological dominance in the profession of economics. And that they need to know that they're captured when they're captured, and they need to know not to be captured, it seems to me, is really important. I came to this because I worked on third world debt. I worked in the development community, and I lived through the 97-98 Southeast Asian financial crisis, which is where I discovered Professor Muriel Rubini when I first discovered the web and how easy it was to get information off the web in 94-95. And lived through that, and at the end of that, when we had campaigned to get $80–90 billion of debt written off, spent 3 years at the New Economics Foundation trying to understand why countries had got into this mess. There were all the usual excuses about, you know, they were incompetent, they were corrupt, you know, they just couldn't manage their finances. There was stuff about, you know, the 1970s petrodollar crisis and so on, but it didn't seem to make sense to me, and I began to look at the history, and I think one of the ideological norms that we lived through was that we lived through the end of history, and that we don't look back. And I looked back at history, and I found that in 1971 was a really crucial turning point for poor countries as well as rich countries. Between 1945 and 1971, there were no financial crises in the world. As Barry Eichengreen has said in his book, and he's the great historian of financial crisis, you know, we were blessed by the benediction of "May you live in very dull times." They were very dull times. There were some tensions in the exchange, in the currency markets, but there were no financial crises. If you look at his book, there's a huge gap between 45 and 71. After 1971, things started to go wrong. And what happened in 71 was that Nixon unilaterally withdrew from the Bretton Woods framework. He unilaterally defaulted on the United States' obligations to repay its debts in gold. It was the biggest sovereign default in history. It made the default by Argentina, Russia, and all of those other countries look like utter peanuts. And I had followed what had happened in Argentina and Russia and so on and so forth. And I knew this all really well. And then I discovered the 71 United States sovereign debt default. President de Gaulle had said, I will only be repaid my debts in gold. I don't want greenbacks. And when the supplies of gold in Fort Knox began to run dry, and the economists came to Nixon and said, look, we've got a problem here. We'd be fighting a war in Vietnam. You know, we've built the great society. We're running out of money. We can't repay President de Gaulle in gold. He said, tell him to go and jump in the lake if you don't want greenbacks. Tough. So unilaterally, the whole Bretton Woods system, now the Bretton Woods system breakdown is always attributed to other causes, and there was no doubt there were some tensions in, and it wasn't perfect by any means. But this act was really, and if you read the history books carefully, economic historians were shocked by it. It was an extraordinarily shocking thing to have done. And there was nothing to put in its place. Gold had been the reserve asset for all the central banks of the world. After 71, there was no reserve asset. And what happened was the IMF was charged with coming up with a new Bretton Woods. It failed. And by default, people said, well, why don't we ask central bank governors to keep in their central banks something called a treasury bill as an asset, as a reserve asset, as an indication of the health of their economy, and the extent of their surpluses. And so from there on, the United States' Treasury bill, which is an IOU signed by the governor of the Federal Reserve, IOU, says the United States, became the reserve assets. And poor countries around the world, Rwanda, Nicaragua, but also China and India, have trillions of dollars of these assets in their central banks. These are loans at very low cost to the United States. And after 71, the United States never had to structurally adjust its economy and restore it to balance. So this is a phenomenal change. And it began to cause instability and turbulence and imbalances. And we saw the United States build up a massive deficit, move from being the world's biggest creditor to becoming the world's biggest debtor. And we saw countries like China begin to build up surpluses. And Keynes had argued that this had been the cause of the 20s and the crisis in the 20s and 30s, and these imbalances were deeply dangerous. So then what I began to see was that, you know, we then had the liberalize, and for the United States to access capital markets, it was absolutely essential to liberalize capital markets and to open up and deregulate. And simultaneously, here in the United Kingdom in 1971, Heath passed something called the Competition and Credit Control Act, which is dubbed as all competition and no control. And thereafter, you began the deregulation of lending and the deregulation of credit creation. And this was like, this was just a gift to the banks and to the finance sector. And what happened was that from 71 till 2008, we had the phenomenon where the finance sector once again became dominant in the economy, whereas Keynes had complained that the finance sector behaved as the master of the economy and not as it should have done as the servant. And in between 45 and 71, much to their disgruntlement, they were servants of the global economy. After 71, they became masters of the universe once again. And we knew this was dangerous. And so what we had was excessive lending here, and then excessive lending across borders to poor countries. Poor countries never used to borrow before that, and the IMF. I mean, it's a long story, but that's how I came to where I've got to. And then it became very clear to me that there were structural imbalances, and I felt very much in 2003 when Neff published this book called The Real World Economic Outlook. The real world, the IMF produces a world economic outlook every year, and we wanted to shadow it, and we called ours the Real World Economic Outlook. Felt a bit like the tourist at Phuket Beach, you know. As the tide's running out, the mathematical modelers in the economics profession are measuring the perturbations on the surface of the water. And it's quite difficult to measure these. The complexity of it was mind-boggling. And nobody was looking at the shifting of the tectonic plates underneath. We, and I also don't want to sound egotistical about this, were looking at the tectonic plates. And from that, it was very clear that at some point something was going to go wrong, very badly wrong. And so we predicted in 2003 that the next big financial crisis was going to be in America and not in Argentina. What we could never get right was to time it correctly. And I remember trying to get my book published in 2006 and saying to Palgrave Macmillan, we've got to get out, we've got to get it out, it's going to burst before, and it didn't. It just went on growing, and I couldn't believe this, you know. And I wasn't alone by any means. I mean, there were a lot of distinguished economists who were seeing this too, and I drew on their wisdom. But unfortunately, they didn't have a voice in the media on the whole. And so these things are fundamental. They're not, as Keynes said, they're not magic. They're not a matter just of mood and confidence. They're actually mechanisms that can easily be fixed. But we live in a world in which the finance sector has, in a sense, taken over and captured us all. And we all are now servants of the finance sector, but we're now all being immensely damaged by the mistakes the finance sector made. And we're going back to, because of course 29 was a credit crunch too. The big asset class which deflated in 29 was stocks and shares. The big asset class now is property. But all asset, there's going to be a massive asset price deflationary bubble, and it's going to apply soon to all assets. Even the art market is going to go down for sure. So, you know, these things have happened before. We've fixed it before with very simple mechanisms. Keynes did that. He's still not understood. One of my grievances with the Financial Times is there's a big debate about Keynes right now. And suddenly the bankers have fallen in love with Keynes because, after all, now you can suddenly draw on taxpayers' money and recapitalize the banks. And suddenly he's very sexy and fashionable. However, he never really believed, he was very strongly against governments expanding their balance sheets in this way, because what it did was it pushed up long-term interest rates. And people trying to buy houses and to buy cars and to invest in their businesses need long-term interest rates to be very low. So the mechanism that he published an article in the New York Times in 1933. In those days, the New York Times took these sorts of stories, in which he directly addressed Roosevelt and said, get the Federal Reserve to start buying up long-term bonds and bring down the long-term rate. And they just applied this tiny mechanism, and interest rates started to come down, and the recovery came back. But to get that story into the Financial Times today, when, like yesterday, Mr. Phelps wrote what I thought was a really distorted article about Keynes, is really quite hard. We've still got blinkers. as to, you know, the kind of ideas that are needed to fix this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I'm going to pile straight into a sort of interaction here between us. I just want to throw my two penneth in, though, because I'm, if anybody is here from the mainstream media, I am. You know, I work for BBC, work for all sorts of rules and oversight that I'm not saying that other people don't, but they're very obvious to one when one is doing one's job. What do I think I got wrong? Let me say this. I was always worried about the global imbalances. I wasn't economics editor until this year, until April this year, but I was business correspondent. I was worried about the global imbalances, the China, you know, the savings model in China, the debt model in America. I presumed there would be a critical point at which they would be resolved. I think everybody did. I thought that I'd covered the dot-com boom as a computer journalist and kind of had a very strong micro understanding of how that bubble had actually worked. But sad to say, disillusioned though I was, I'd seen both dot-com, well, above all dot-com, and the Asian financial crisis as well, be handled by the central authorities. That is, by allowing it to deflate and then on to the next boom, onto the next bubble, by easy, cheap money. And who knows but what that, in 6 months' time, there are government ministers who believe that this will be resolved very quickly by a monetary expansion. Okay, now, I think that was the one thing. The other thing I think that is certainly true is that you only have 24 hours in a day. And what I decided to do with my career was to not hang around asking fruitless questions to business people, which is what the BBC kind of wanted us to do. You remember in the early 2000s, there was a big, you've got to be nice to business, you've got to understand it more. And as I kind of agree with that to an extent, as an operational level business journalist who's covered operations rather than finance. But I thought, well, there's a diminishing amount of interest in this. I'll go to China. I'll go to Bolivia. I'll get a camera. I'll go down a Bolivian tin mine. I'll be in the field with the Glen Eagles protesters as they pull the chain link fence down. And so my agenda became focused on that level of contradiction. I never believed that there would be a moment where the bubble was deflating, that they would mishandle so badly. And of course, it's not a subjective issue. It is fairly clear to me now that it was going to happen, that whatever Geithner and Co had decided on the 12th, 13th of September, something like this would have happened. I think it's that. I think my focus, valuable though it is, I think one's focus has to be on the main thing. My retrospective self-criticism would be that it could have been possible to do some of that stuff towards high finance. Certainly, I would say, if you watch our stuff we did on Newsnight, me, Stephanie, some of the other people who come in and out of it, once it was clear what was happening, I think we were, i.e. after Northern Rock, I think we piled in. My stuff on Bear Stearns in March this year, I'd say, look at that, that's decent journalism. But I'd focused on something else. And I'll say one other thing about being a mainstream media BBC type journalist. The thing on, what's that film called? Good Night and Good Luck with George Clooney. Yeah, the bit where he does his scoop and then he turns around after the camera goes and he says, "You know how many shit stories I now have to do because of that." That everybody in television, I think probably everybody in journalism, but especially in television, that is the social silence in TV. For every decent one you do, you've got to repay whoever it is, the system, with 5 completely anodyne stories. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. Put your hand, come back to me if you work in TV and that's wrong, but that's what I think. Okay, now, opening it up, can I ask the panel, let's start at the top, institutions. Before we start, wearing our own hair shirt, is there anything about the institutions we work for and the culture of those institutions that should have allowed us, and let's keep this snappy, to do what we did better?
Well, when I first looked at this, I just finished reading Nick Davis's Journalism, so I was very fresh in my mind, and in a sense probably was one of the things that made me get particularly interested in this. And I have witnessed in recent years the effect of journalism, and I have worked for newspapers, business section newspapers, where the message has become increasingly, and this is not the FT, I have to say, it's the mainstream sections. It's, unless you can put a celebrity at the front of a story, they're not really interested. You've got to have a picture of Posh Spice that demonstrates something about fashion. They're less and less interested in investigations, delving into... And even, I've put this up in the past, I've said, well, why don't we do a series that shows how the city really works for ordinary people? Because most people, it's a mystery.
Yeah.
So why don't we do a series that shows nobody's interested? They want, but, you know, there's this big emphasis, which is all part of the journalism, making everything, bite-sized, digestible, assuming that the readers can't deal with anything that's complex or takes anything. And I think it's all part of this age of orthodoxy that we now live in, that there's no room for someone to take a different approach. There's a very, very limited range of areas. So, I was certainly conscious of that occurring, and it's much wider. So that was really where I was personally coming from out of this. Gillian.
I'd point to two things. Firstly, resources. 3 years ago, people who really understood how a CDO worked tended to work for a bank and get paid 20 times more than a journalist. And the reality is that basically we've not had the... Well, I happen to think the FT's done, on some occasions not too bad a job. But, let's face it, the bank's PR teams are extremely well-resourced and funded compared to the media. And that's part of a wider debate about how we actually fund the media more generally. Because unless you actually have a well-funded media, you won't get extensive oversight. Secondly, silos are a big problem. One of the reasons I think I was able to sit down and sketch out how the city worked and try and think laterally was because I was working on the Lex column, which happens to be one of the bits of paper on the FT where we actually have debt markets, equity markets, all aspects of corporate finance and corporate behaviour interact. Now, the FT has actually done amazing stuff in the last few years to try and overcome the issue of silos, but there is the tremendous pressure always, which one has to be alert to, that silos will reflect the world that existed 20 years ago, and the glory and the status and glamour inside a paper will tend to reflect what people outside the paper want that to be. Again, this is me deflating into social anthropology here. But, I'd say within the FT, I think we've actually reorganised a lot in the last few years to try and, overcome that. But it's a challenge.
Michael?
I can't speak for the specialist press, but I think within the general press, the general media, there's a fear of data. I think it has something to do with Paul's observation about concentration on individuals and individual narratives. But we are not very good with data. And, there is a temptation to take the 1 month's figures from Marks and Spencer's and decide that this is, that Stuart Rose is the oracle of the high street. And he is not. I mean, they're an important retail, but they're not the whole thing. Again, I'm extraordinarily struck by, this simple question of proportion. Where's all the business going on in the city? What are we reporting? It seems to me such an elementary question. Let's look at the size of these relative markets, see which ones are important. Now, just the numeracy, I think, is two things. One is simply, the first one, is just the disposition to look at the numbers, apart from any capacity to use them well. And I think that, curiously, in a lot of our economic coverage, we don't have the disposition to look at the numbers. That sounds like an outrageous claim. Can I offer one more example? Is £37 billion a large number? The size of the bank bailout. Relative to the net present value of the government's right to tax in perpetuity, I don't think it is, actually, £37 billion. They can do that bank bailout again and again. It's not even real debt, since it's not been yet advanced, and the fact that there is an asset there as well, unlike almost any other government debt, which we'll probably be able to cash in one day, and yet it's been compared to the primary school's budget, or the whole defence budget, as if somebody wheeled the money out in a barrow out of the Treasury door.
They did.
I mean, simple concepts. Are these large numbers? Are they the right numbers? Have we looked back at the trends to decide whether 0.2% is a large change in manufacturing or not? I mean, it really is extraordinarily elementary, and I think somehow we get carried away. We lose sight of some very basic proportional questions. And so, well, I would say this because this is the kind of thing I'm banging on about, and to everybody's distress nowadays, is that we need to teach journalists to count.
I would say that I'm an outsider here, but what should be learned is that we need more plurality of opinion inside newspapers and inside the media, and I think that should be a rule. And also plurality doesn't mean having one point of view and the opposite point of view. I always find that very difficult as well. But for me, the other important thing is, please, I get very fed up with The Guardian, which has pages and pages of company news and one page on economics. You know, I was so relieved when the FT shunted all its company news into a second half of the paper, you know. But what we don't get enough of, in my view, is an analysis. People want things explained to them. I mean, they want to understand numbers. 37 billion is beyond most people's imagination. But concepts are not beyond most ordinary people's understanding. And journalists need to think more conceptually. I think the French, on the whole, are better at this. And instead of just measuring the perturbations on the surface, you know, trying to do some analysis and having more time both on the BBC for that analysis and for that kind. And people are fascinated by economics. Everybody's life is dominated by economics, but we don't give it that space.
Gillian.
I just want to say one thing, which is practically speaking, and I look back at my time before 2007, the American media tends to think it's a real no-no to write comment pieces and to report. The British media has less strict demarcations that way. Back in 2006, when I was reporting, I also started writing comment pieces, and I had some pretty sharp criticism from parts of the American government at the time. One of the reasons I wanted to write comment pieces was because back then it was very hard, I felt, to do hard, tangible reporting and get the numbers that would illustrate the scale of the problem going on. It was easier to do it through comment and through analysis. But the question as to what degree you can blend comment and reporting as a journalist, and whether there are times when actually you need to blend it because, guess what, it's very murky and you can't get the data, is a valid one. And I think we need to recognise that, you know, there are different cultural traditions between America and the UK, which need to be examined too.
I'll take you in a minute, but I'll just throw into that. I mean, there's even more off the wall is speculation. Speculation has been part of the philosophical tradition. What would happen if this happened? My boss, my former boss, Peter Barron, invented a whole television genre called If, but the first one of which was what would happen if we ran out of gas. And we got all kinds of because you can't. We hadn't run out of gas, and you know, as soon as the interconnect thing switched on, we did start running out of gas. But he decided to do a what if, and it was done as science fiction and had a lot of flack. But I would even say speculation. That is beyond comment and analysis. It is literally Daniel Defoe territory. Is the full armoury of journalism. And you know, I think you pose a very valid point. You want to raise it?
I want to throw a bit of a spanner in the works here because, you know, we're saying journalists didn't spot this and therefore it's all their fault, and there is very interesting, you know, there are lots of interesting aspects of that. But if you look back, you could say that the Enron and WorldCom scandals, all the writing was on the wall there.
Yeah.
If you read them, you can see you can now see what was going to happen. But slightly counterintuitively, I was talking a while ago with a leading financial investigator who gave me a rather different take on this, and I think that, you know, you've got to look at different sides of it. And he said to me, what is different to Enron and WorldCom is that their problems were in the company accounts if you knew where to look. The composition of CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, were known only to a handful of people in the owning company and do not appear in company accounts. This was a story that was impossible to crack without whistleblowers. Now, I'm not sure. I'm putting it forward. You know, the person is a very good and thoughtful person and very experienced in this area. So it's certainly worth. This is the other side of my proposition. Is it so difficult now for journalists to crack this that we can no longer do it? Which leads on to the fact that can the regulators do it? And what are tax havens there for? Well, you know, Enron was about tax havens. You know, tax havens aren't there just to have banks. They're there to hide money. And, you know, where did all this money go? This is, you know, these are all linked. So this is a different dimension. I have to say that, at the risk of a sort of collective hug here, one anonymous semi-whistleblower did emerge, I noticed, in January 2007. And this was an email to someone called Gillian Tett, who had took the unusual step, I thought, of printing extracts from a banker. I had sent her a note in which she described as a chilling read. And in this, the banker, I nearly said he, but it could be a she, says, quote, "I don't think there has ever been a time in history when such a large proportion of the riskiest credit assets have been owned by such financially weak institutions with very limited capacity to withstand adverse credit events and market turndowns." In a sense, this piece, which I've been using for a while, is what really stands as my first journalistic warning, a serious warning of something deeply wrong in the state of Denmark, with some very specific elements to it.
Can I try and ask, because look, in things like, you know, the army, what they do, if they lose a battle, sometimes they go, well, let's redo it. Let's relook at it. What would we have done? What would be the textbook way of doing this right if everything else had been the same? Has anybody got any ideas about what journalism as a discipline and the media as an institution could have done right if we had the chance to play it all out again from, say, mid-2005? Just briefly. What about you?
It's so much easier to spot these things in hindsight.
Yeah, but go on, suppose you had the hindsight. What would you have done?
If I had that, well, let's imagine you're sitting there and you see a sudden, apparently very successful growth in a certain area of finance. And you don't know if this is really genuine economic success or whether it's something going rather wrong, a sort of ridiculous quantity of stupid people with a lot of stupid money, as Walter Bagehot once put it. I don't know. How do you prick that bubble before you know that it's a bubble? It's extraordinarily difficult. These financial instruments, I think, that that people were inventing that around those times. I mean, there is a good case for some of these things in principle. And if somebody had said to me, look, I've had this idea of insuring against a loss on an investment in an asset, I'd say that sounds reasonable. And then somebody else says, well, let's trade these. And I think, well, I don't quite know how that works, but, I'll take your word for it. And suddenly, that's the problem. Yeah.
But if you take it to the subprime, I mean, let's go back down to basics and take it away from the, what on earth was happening in America? The Miami Herald in July of this year did an investigation into the subprime mortgage market in July, and they discovered when they started looking that the mortgage brokers who were selling subprime had a huge influx in numbers, of which a substantial percentage were people with criminal records with fraud. Now, what was going on that nobody noticed that subprime was a massive criminal enterprise? It might have suited, but where are journalists in this? This is what journalists are supposed to do. This is what they're supposed to look at. So where were the journalists who spotted these things happening from 2003, 4, 5 and 6? This is the sort of interesting question that I'm sort of interested in. And I'm not saying that. I do wonder where American journalists is, but that's another question for the Americans to deal with, in some degree to deal with. But didn't any British journalists often go to America to investigate things that American journalists don't notice? No British journalists actually thought, what is the subprime market? How does it work?
When the housing market is rising, and I wonder how many people here were convinced that a rising housing market was a reasonable thing on which to bet that you could take a 100% mortgage. People shaking their heads, but quite a lot did, and a lot were all right. And now what's all right? 95%? The market's gone down by 20, or whatever it is. How much have you seen last year? 15 in the last year? An annualised rate of 2.5% if it continues for a year. We're looking at a lot. 85%? That's not safe, really. So and here's another reasonable case for saying the one that's been blamed by some people on the right wing in America, that actually this was encouraged because we wanted to see poor people own houses.
That's perfectly true.
I mean, again, I think it went too far. I'm not trying to say it, but one has to try and go back and say, were there compelling reasons for believing the stories at the time? And I think there were. And the great difficulty is that we only see that they weren't sound when we discover who was selling the stuff.
Can I say that I think in 2005 journalists should have just looked around, actually. And they should have looked around because, our voices were fairly marginal, but there were a lot of mainstream. Professor Wynne Godley at Cambridge was writing stuff for the Levy Institute, which was really terrifying. And it was terrifying me And, you know, I found it on the web, for God's sake, so journalists should have found that stuff. But, most importantly, we had before us the living example of what happens when you build up a massive credit bubble and it deflates, and you don't take quick enough remedied action to deal with that bubble. And that was Japan. Japan's credit bubble burst in 1990. House prices started to fall in 1990. As of 2008, house prices are still falling in Japan. It's still happening in front of our eyes. Why didn't people look at Japan? In 2005, if I was a journalist, I would have just looked at Japan. And lots of people were. Japan is a big OECD country. It's not Rwanda. It's easy to find on the map. Why weren't they finding it?
Well, there was I actually had a series of conversations, because actually I worked in Japan in the late 1990s, and I wrote a book about Japan, and I was very struck by the similarities and had a series of conversations with people in America. And even as late, I mean, the Japanese were telling the Americans in the summer of 2007, this looks unbelievably familiar. Yes. I mean, one of the things that spooked me was in July 2007, before the infamous August date, what actually put me on red alert was getting a series of emails from Japanese saying this is identical, and it was identical. The Americans were fabulously arrogant and huffy. I had a series of arguments with people and the thought that they could possibly have anything to learn, as were the British.
Just very briefly, I mean, the extraordinary thing about these things is they are very familiar, and they happen over and over again in very similar fashion. I mean, I do recommend to you Charles Kindleberg, your Mania's Panics and Crashes, written in 1978, where the language describing past excesses,
I'm sorry, but
it could apply identically. I mean, an excess of credit, I mean, all these, in some ways, borrowing and mania are synonymous. There is always excess borrowing, perhaps not on this scale, perhaps not in this form, but there is always excess borrowing during a mania.
I was going to say, I mean, if you're asking what can you do in practical terms, I mean, one of the problems why it's very hard to have the luxury of time to look back at the history and think deeply as a journalist, or in my case, you know, delve into the minutiae of CDOs in a way that will build a devastating argument to basically get the banking PRs off your back, is because we haven't got the resources. It's that simple. You know, I think in that context, we need to actually go back to the point you're making, try and get a sense of proportion, try and step back and say, okay, how does this village around us interconnect? Where's the money? Above all else, where's the money? Who's making it? Where's it going? What's important? Try and put resources as a media industry into wherever the money is going. And whistleblowers. I mean, the point you made about the email is actually very important, because I got a lot of emails, and it was one of the reasons why I used to you know, be a bit more critical than many other outlets at the time. It's hard, you know, to know whether to use anonymous emails or not. But at the moment, I think that the internet has given us a powerful tool for gathering dissenting views, if we're prepared to use it. It's difficult. We're going to have to rethink the rules of engagement as journalists about how we do it. But there is actually one opportunity there as well.
Quick point from you, then I'm going to throw it to the floor.
It's very important to realise that, you know, you can say that journalists, you know, nobody spotted, therefore journalists are all right. But it's actually not true. And you know, if you actually start to look back, who was, you know, ringing the alarm? You've got Warren Buffett as early as 2003. You've got, if you do a literary review, you find there's lots of serious academics making the point, and dare I say, another non-journalist, Anne Petticoat, who raises the issue. It depends who you listen to, whether you've got the ability to you know, actually listen to the dissident voices. I mean, it's really interesting to compare this to the Iraq War, because on the one hand, we've had this big introspection about it, and on what we have there was a case where the government, there were supposed to be weapons of mass destruction, and it turns out that journalists said there were, but there weren't. And in this case, we've got journalists saying that, you know, just progressing as normal, in fact, ignoring the fact that there were what Warren Buffett describes as weapons of mass destruction. And, you know, it's a very interesting fact that when I first started, it was until very recently, no journalist was really introspective about this. And I think Evan Davis was the only one I'd seen being self-critical that I've found so far up to very, very recently.
Right, let's just throw it to the floor. It is going to be a limited amount of time, I'm sorry, but let's try and ask questions and make very brief points. This gentleman here, it'll take 2 minutes before this thing comes to you, this red thing. You first, and then the lady in front of you.
Just to Gillian Tett, those anonymous sources, I mean, how many of them did you manage to coax out and get them to explain to you forensically what was happening? Or could you just describe a bit about how that works, you know?
People would talk at great length about, you know, in general about the problems. In terms of, you know, but as always, you know, the way one writes stories, one wanted specific deals, one wanted numbers, one wanted evidence, because otherwise it always sounds very vague and disembodied and general. And one of the biggest problems about what's happened is that we've basically had a revolution occur in cyberspace. It's virtual finance, and it's flipping hard to photograph, to illustrate, to actually capture. You know, at least with the Iraq War, you actually had bombs and suffering people to illustrate it with. I mean, I don't mean to sound flip, but you actually had tangible things you could watch and track and monitor. Cyberspace finance is very hard to illustrate. So I was always looking for data, and that was a problem. That's one of the reasons why I resorted to columns a lot of the time. But I want to say, I mean, by the way, the BIS wrote an absolutely devastating paper, series of papers in 2003, 2004.
Yeah.
They were effectively shut up by the US government.
What's it
The Bank of International Settlements.
Yeah, Bank for International Settlements. And so there were people out there talking about it, but it was this great big, you know, you were faced against this wall of religion, this fanatical belief system, which said that risk dispersion worked and it would be okay.
Man here, then a woman here.
Could I just support what Gillian says, and also to say that there were several journalists who have done good things over the years. She's one. Ian Carr at Financial News has been asking questions for a long time. Larry Elliott has been at The Guardian. Dan Atkinson at the Mail on Sunday has. And whistleblowers are important. A friend of mine wrote this in 1998 about how New Labour was being sucked into city orthodoxy. What was his source? His source was his sister was a city regulator. She'd been there at the time of Big Bang. She got him interested in this. Review copies were sent to all the political and economic press, and not a single person reviewed the book. We were caught in exactly the cultural glitch that Anne says. Nobody wanted to think outside the box, and there's no time now for most people to do it, even if they want.
Who wants to respond to that from the...
Just briefly, I mean, the really interesting question is, when there are dissidents around, and it seems that there were a few, I mean, Robert Schiller was another one, why don't we believe them? Where does the momentum come from that is capable of dismissing, you know, the emperor has no clothes criticism?
Okay.
Well, I was going to draw a parallel with my own experience when I was reporting on Central Europe before the revolutions and a bit during and then after. And I do remember making trips to Yugoslavia before, you know, in 86 and 87, and coming back to London and saying, gosh, you know, trouble's really brewing, but I couldn't really know exactly how it was all going, you know, how the trouble was going to brew. And people weren't interested because they saw everything through a Cold War prism. And Yugoslavia was okay because it was non-aligned, and everything just fell into those categories. And if it was something outside those categories, they couldn't see it, basically. So that was one point. But the other thing is that you need detail to break through that. You need a mass of telling detail in order to break through those preconceptions. And it's true that these things have always happened and there's a cycle and they go back in history. But if you say, oh, well, yes, it always happens, it ends up sounding a bit vague and general. I mean, even in 2006, you had trouble, even though you were actually quite close. Even that short period seems like too long if things seem to be going well. And so if you say, well, it was ever thus, it goes up and then it goes down, people are then just able to dismiss it unless they've got a mass of telling detail, and that it's hard to get that.
But we had that. I mean, I don't go with this thing about speculative manias and panics and things. I mean, those stories are fascinating in themselves, but you know, there is no iron rule that says that we're going to have to live through these things. We created a framework which made this happen. It didn't happen. It wasn't a matter of spontaneous combustion. It wasn't a matter of good guys and bad guys.
But there are always
it was a
reasons.
No. 1971, we started to set up a framework which encouraged credit creation and which said that this was really an important thing to do and it could be risk-free and that we need not worry about it. And that least of all should we regulate it. We should not regulate this. This should be happen. The market knows. You know, a traditional economic theory has no theory for catastrophe. Markets do not, they correct, and the correction can be ugly and it can be, you know, but they correct, they come back to balance. There's no concept that's why all the monetarists are so silent. There's no concept of failure, of global economic failure. It isn't there. So the theory doesn't have that, but the framework that was set up to create such economic failure. And so it's not accident. It's a matter of laws. We set up regulations. We introduced laws in 1971 in which we took the hand off the tiller and said, yes, it's fine for bankers and finance sector to behave like this. So now to blame them seems to me utterly irrational. You know, they behaved as one would logically behave in that framework. I'm against going on at bankers and bonuses. I really think that's really not the point. I want to go for the regulators. I want to go for the governors of the central banks and the politicians, because these laws don't get written by bankers. Bankers might take you on a yacht to Corfu in order to get you to do that, but you don't. The bankers don't write the laws. The politicians do, and the regulators do, and those are the guys we should go after.
Right, there was something related to this very important, I think. Now, I was listening to Niall Ferguson on Start the Week earlier this week, and when it came to the blame game, he said, well, you know, it's not just the bankers, it's all those people who had 100% mortgages. And I thought, well, hold on a minute. This is really rather sinister because, OK, a lot of people got involved in trying to make profit on their homes, but actually, these are people's homes when you think about it. These are what people use to live in. And we've all been dragged in the last 30 years after 71, into this massive notion that we've been thrown like bears into the, you know, like Christians into the arena to play the financial game, I often think. And what interests me is that I sometimes think, well, it's what it's like is you get all these people, you all say, right, I'll take you all now, from now on, you make your living in a Ladbrokes casino. And you all know that the only people who's going to make any money out of this are the people who own it. And that we're all children in comparison to these people. So why are we being forced into this situation where we start to view our houses as speculative objects? We live in houses.
No, but I think, can I just answer? Because I think it's worse than that. Because if you look at the numbers, and let's look at numbers now, wages and salaries of middle classes and the working classes were repressed as a share of the national cake. So they fell down, you know, they began to stagnate. Social housing was eliminated from, you know, the choices that you had. What people had no choice. First of all, they had to borrow to send their kids to university, to buy a home or to whatever, because their income was shrinking as a share of the cake. You know, the share the finance sector was taking was expanding. And people were, and this is particularly true in the United States, so people had to borrow. There were no houses. You couldn't, you know, if you're a young couple, and I have a family, you know, of young couples, you can't go and find social housing if you've got a baby and you've got somewhere to live. You've got to go and borrow, and you've got to go and buy a house on the market.
And, I mean,
it became impossible.
The point is that, I mean, you're pointing to a social ill, but what is it that our discipline can do about that? I mean, there's an obvious point, because it's the big ideology, isn't it? I mean, who's going to stand up and say, you all shouldn't have 100% mortgages, and I'm going to campaign here in the page of the Daily Mail to stop you getting them?
Yeah, that's the idea.
One second, let me give that man a microphone for 1 second. But before that, this woman in the corner, please. No, the woman in the corner. I'll take you now.
Right, okay. I just wanted to ask, we've talked a lot about the complexity of the markets and the fact that that's one of the reasons why there hadn't been the reporting that there should have been, and indeed that there are powerful voices that have quashed any sort of dissidence. But what about the idea that the media is actually comprised of human beings, and it's human beings, these journalists, that also have a vested interest in the success of financial markets? And do you think that played a role in the blindness?
Anybody?
Were you investing, Gillian?
I'll tell you. Let me give you an anecdote.
Only in the sense that the point I'm becoming tedious about, that we're all caught up in the same kind of expectations, and that the game that was being played in the markets was much like the game we were all playing with our houses. And the same game that the media were playing in continuing to report getting on the same narrative train. I think there is enormous momentum in these things.
I would just say, slightly on a positive note, I've spent a lot of time in America in the last 2 years. And it's astonishing to me if you watch things like CNBC or a lot of the American shows, they're almost cheering that stock market up. It's like, wah-hey, they have all these, you know what I mean? Maria Bartiromo stands there, it's like, wah-hey, it's ended up. I would say the one good thing about the British media is generally we're not sitting there trying to cheer the stock market up as such. We might have plenty of BBC programmes, trying to cheer the property prices up, or what a wonderful idea to go and buy 3 extra houses in Bulgaria tomorrow.
I mean, it poses a point. Before I take this gentleman in the back, for me, I'll see you as well. On the day AIG went bust, I was in New York, standing outside the building, trying to work out what was happening. I now know that while I was there, key decisions were taking place. There was no way of getting it. My contacts in AIG are not great. Okay, but the really interesting thing is all day, on every channel, people are going, the markets are down, the markets are up, the markets are down, this tiny stock has moved X. It's like 24 hours a day of rubbish. And I remember writing, look, the actual only thing that any of these channels should be worried about is the unpredictable and massive decisions that are being taken by 3 people, Geithner, Paulson. The state, in other words, had become the only thing that you should really at this point be studying, because it is the decisive factor. And yet it was utterly frustrating to see that the whole machine of journalism was just carrying on as if in that week, I mean, the markets meant nothing that week. The equity markets, I think, meant nothing. It was the action of regulators that mattered. Let me take you, sir, and then there's a gentleman here as well, and then after that, the man right in front of you will also get a try. Let's take 3 points for the audience.
Okay, Scott Key. I just wanted to come back on your point about, how can the Daily Mail say that owning a house is bad? And there was this ideological thing, I think, going back to the Clintons. I mean, no doubt you're aware that Spectator's saying it's all the left's fault.
Oh, yeah.
But, there's, I think the problem with the ideological side is there was a need to look at the subprime situation, as you said, that there was some fraud going on. But that wasn't the kind of thing that a lot of journalists were going to go looking for. It wasn't very PC to go that route. That was one side, and the other side is the structural stuff that I definitely don't understand since 1971. Those seem to me to be the 2 things that I really, really understand in this, and for that you need somebody like Anne, I suppose. But it's a very interesting combination.
Gentleman there with the microphone, then the man in front of you, and then a man here as well, if somebody can give him a mic as well.
Well, we mentioned about the issue of deregulation. And now, with the hindsight we have, I don't think we're covering enough the issue of the responsibility of politicians in this. I think this has given a great platform to a lot of politicians to come out with all this sanctimonious language about the evil bankers. And so why isn't the media really covering the responsibility that a lot of these people had in creating the situation?
Can I just say, just briefly on regulation, there are a number of regulations which made the thing a heck of a lot worse. And in trying to work out which regulations you impose in order to stick some plaster on it in order to stop these happening again, you have to be absolutely sure that they're not going to make it worse again. So there are regulations, for example, that insist certain financial institutions only hold investment-grade stock. Some of that stock was devalued, became junk bond. Every institution that held it on the planet had to unload it today. The mark-to-market, it suddenly became worthless. You've got to get rid of it. That's a regulatory insistence, and it's designed to stop people hiding their losses. And it's designed, partly, and it's also designed to stop people who invest your pension investing your pension in junk.
Okay,
and yes, there's this disastrous effect that, it exacerbated all the trends.
I'm going to ask my fellow panellists to just restrain for a minute. I'll hear a few more from people on the floor. You, sir, there.
Yeah, I think it goes beyond 1971, indeed, to the establishment of the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, the so-called Glorious Revolution, leading to the Bank of England by the Amsterdam bankers. Basically, we're not asking questions about financial usurious capitalism. I'll be very specific. Point one, for instance, you mentioned CDOs in this debate so far. Well, but what about demystifying fractional reserve banking? What about fiat currency and usury? Now, these are taboos. Every society has taboos. Unless these are exposed and clarified, we're not going to get out of this. And second point, resources. The lady mentioned resources. There is a whole body of movement in Europe and in this country called the monetary reform movement. It has different shades. It includes Muslims, Christians and others, even non-believers. And there's a very powerful movement. And that resource throughout Europe has not been tapped. And let me tell you, people, I don't agree with these people totally. LaRouche, Ian Dallas, in 91 when I went to Grenada, at the time of the New World Order, they have got fundamental critiques on the system and the solution. There are simple solutions. Unless we look at the creation and control of money, we're going to get nowhere. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Amanda in here. I see you two as well, and that lady there. So pass it forward a bit.
I would like to suggest that you're being a little tough on yourselves, actually, because the banking crisis was only possible because of the global imbalances that you were talking about. And I think it is true to say that for the last 3-4 years at G8 meetings and in many publications, you could read the fact that people realized that in the old economies we were borrowing in order to sustain demand in those countries, in order to buy goods from those that would save and would finance it. And we knew that. I mean, everybody knew that. And we also knew that 50% of the United States population's real disposable income was falling, and that the feel-good factor, both in America and here, was completely underpinned by the increasing value of their apparent wealth through their assets, which was funded by debt. Now, this is not post-fact. I mean, people were writing about this. They knew about it. So what went wrong? What went wrong was that the conventional wisdom was that it was a problem that could be solved, that the imbalances could be solved, and that the credit boom could be contained and then reduced by what was called deleveraging. Remember, there was the term, people were talking about deleveraging long before those crises, right? I'm with Anatol Kerensky on this. I mean, I think the thing that fucked this up was the decision to allow Lehman Brothers to go bust, because the reason what you believed as serious financial journalists would happen, which was that it had to be reversed, and it would be reversed under control, was suddenly impossible. Yes. Because of a few poor decisions. And I'm not sure you could have predicted it. This is my point about you. I mean, I know you're now saying, oh, God, if only we'd looked at this and that. But actually, people were looking at all the right things, and they probably were drawing the right conclusion, which is that it could be contained and managed, and we could come down slowly from this. It just didn't happen because of a few events that happened in September this year.
Okay. So keep restraining yourselves on the platform for a bit, and I'll take this guy here. And there was it a woman that was you next? Yes.
I'm a television producer, so I'm keen to kind of get back to the issues about journalism and all this. I've been trying to make a programme about collateralised debt since, I don't know, mid-2006. after being in Columbus, Ohio, where the auto workers were on strike. They previously worked for GM Delphi. There'd been a massive default in the bonds that company had. That was a kind of an early signal of where things might go. But in all that time, the issues about whistleblowers have been key from my point of view. I've been fed lots of good information from people, but getting them on the record without paying them substantial sums of money is almost impossible. Even anonymously, even filmed, behind dark screens. Tell me about it. It's just almost impossible. I mean, Robert Reich's book about supercapitalism kind of makes that point, that if you're Channel 4, and I mean, Channel 4 have rejected the idea, the Money Programme rejected the idea, all of these people I've had this discussion with, you end up saying, £200,000 is not enough to make a 1-hour current affairs programme about this issue. It's a bit like you need supergrasses, you need to pay people, you need to get them on the record, and as far as I can see, nobody's able to do that yet. I don't know if anybody on the panel thinks they can make a proposition whereby something like that might be acceptable to the mainstream broadcasters.
Newsnight did a 15-minute film on CDSs before
CDOs.
No credit default swaps.
All right.
And but I'm still not met a Newsnight producer who understands it, and it's been out. Let me just take this lady here, and then I'll come back to the panel.
Okay. In terms of
in
terms of conventional wisdom, I'm wondering about this continued use of the phrase "Britain is going into recession." I don't remember any recession that was so widely accepted and not just predicted, but accepted. We are going into recession. Well, if people read that every day, of course they're not going to buy a car. And I think many people are wondering why the financial mechanism will not operate to mitigate it. But I also want to say something about risk management and black boxes, because I used to do a lot of journalism in the city, and I was writing about derivatives. And of course I didn't understand them, but nobody did. And I was very conscious of what Gillian said, the huge income disparity between journalists, and the fact that I was a financial journalist was sort of a joke, because I didn't read numbers. I carefully avoided them, but I could write about, well, I wasn't doing company accounts, but I could write about the world of it. And I wrote, and many of the trade magazine editors wrote about the risk. They wrote about the huge investment in risk management, which has turned out to be empty, and the black boxes. Maybe Gillian can explain. This was the derivatives. It was the CDOs, all these things that the top management couldn't understand. It was an ongoing joke. Everybody knew that, and I could wonder why we in the media didn't make more of a fuss. And the reason is because the best and the brightest in the States and here, those who study physics and maths, were going into the city and not into teaching or journalism. And that is really the long-term tragedy that I would love to see addressed.
Because of time, I'm going to have to cut you, the audience, down a bit there, and I'm going to come back to our panel. I will say that this is a club, and you're welcome to hang around, I think, and have a drink. There's a drink there, and carry on networking afterwards. But I will now go through our panel, and I will just say to the panel, I think we're very clear about what you've said has been the problem. Obviously, we could go on forever about that. I wonder whether the panel can think of things we ought to do. I'm very keen for this not to just to be a kind of what-if session, for us to be able to say, we could go to the Society of Editors, go to my bosses and say, there were probably 150 people in a room, and they said certain things that we ought to be thinking about doing. What does anybody on the panel want to pile in?
Well, I'll go. I really want to see a really detailed piece of, analysis that looks at exactly what happened, what the criteria, and divide it up to parameters, proper academic research into it. Because while that sounds quite dry, it's the only way we're going to be able to draw really serious conclusions from this. And, there are lots of questions to answer. And one question would be, do we train financial journalists properly in this country? And this data aversion, I personally am of that old school of journalists who believes that a journalist should be able to tackle anything and learn anything. But there are some things that, really, if you're doing it day in, you've really got to get to grips with. And I wonder if we should have, there are virtually no universities training financial journalists in this country, and there are hundreds of people being taught to do fashion and sports journalism, and nobody being taught how to add up.
Make a commitment in 10 years' time to make a very boring programme about a new financial paradigm, or instrument, or whatever, that everybody is convinced has changed the way that we do things for the better. And be sceptical. I mean, that's the difficulty. At the time when these things begin, at the time when you could head them off, they're very, very hard to spot. And, the kind of surveillance of the whole mechanism. And maybe the only person who, really did it about this is the development of Death in That Way, and Gillian to some extent. It's just enormously hard to stop these things. And actually, if you're successful in stopping them, where's the evidence that it was important to stop it anyway?
Yeah.
I would say, please don't patronise your readers. That's what I would say to editors. Do you know, the people out there are deeply interested in this stuff. They'd really like to know. They'd like to know and they'd like to understand, and they're not stupid. I mean, the thing I learned from Jubilee 2000, when we began the campaign, people said to me, you'd never get a mass movement excited about sovereign debt and international financial negotiations. And we had very minuscule resources. We had the internet, because the internet had just been discovered when we started campaigning, and we just started educating our supporters. We taught them what the pre-cut-off date debt was for deciding what debt was eligible for cancellation. And then when, you know, creditors came along and said, oh, we've cancelled 100% of the debt, but the cut-off date for the debt that they were cancelling was, you know, 18 years ago, so they were only cancelling very old debt, and they weren't cancelling all the debt that had been, you know, we worked that out, we explained it to our supporters, they wrote to the Treasury and said, why in cancelling Uganda's debt have you not taken into account the pre-cut-off date debt? We think this is outrageous. Yours sincerely, on a pink piece of paper with a bunch of roses in the corner. You know, these were ordinary people who could understand these complex concepts. So what I'd say to editors is don't patronise your readers. And please, stop giving us pages and pages of fashion company reports, gossip, celebrities. Please, give us some serious economic analysis, because economics affects every single person. People, and it's sexy, you know. But one of the other things I would say is that beware of fraud. Credit default swaps are not swaps. They're a form of insurance. They were called swaps in order to evade the regulatory radar. Right? There is no collateral backing up these damn things, and that's the problem with it. And journalists have to be careful of fraud in the financial system and of the way in which things are labelled and made obscure in order for us not to understand them. That would be my advice.
I would just say, look at the social silence as much, if not more, than the social noise. And look at the areas of society which are deemed to be boring and unsexy and dull and technical, because that is probably what will end up blowing up the world, rather than the sexy, highfalutin stuff.
Yeah.
2 years ago, the total assumption of the regulatory community and bankers and journalists as well was that if anything was going to blow up the financial system, it would be a highfalutin hedge fund, like long-term capital management. And so much so that, you know, the Germans, when they had the G7 chair, they spent all their time worrying about how to ban the hedge funds. It wasn't the hedge funds that blew it up. It was the boring vehicles like structured investment vehicles, like CDOs, AAA debt, super senior debt, which was so mind-numbingly dull that no one even realised what it was, how big it was, or paid any attention, and it was very hard to get it off page 423 of the FT. We did at least cover it on the FT. I would say we're pretty much the only ones who did, on the mainstream press. But look for the areas of social silence.
What is the theory of... I mean, where can people read about how to do that, apart from being a good journalist? But how can people do... Because, you know...
Well, I would say go and study a bit of sanctioned anthropology, but anyway, that's a bit partial.
Good.
Write a novel.
Well, this is exactly... Cosmopolis by Don DeLillo is all about this. It was written 5 years ago, wasn't it? OK, right, I am going to call it a halt there, because I can tell people are just buzzing now, and so am I. Unfortunately, I've got to go on the telly. But and you can judge that against this. I don't know whether it'll be any better for having been here. I'd like to thank all our panellists, and thank you for extremely engaging and interesting stuff. And I'd say, I'm one of these people who thinks that if we all went away and swapped emails and actually carried on talking to each other, the wisdom of the crowd would get us to where we wanted to go quicker than... We might not, but it might. And if anybody feels like going away and grabbing 5 other people and saying, let's carry on talking about this, I'm sure it would have a great sort of... It wouldn't be a bad thing to do. Thank you once again for coming.